Who would you say are the three or four best published poets in the last century?
Worldwide or American or English
Just
one?
just worldwide.
Oh, best three or four. Well, let's say, well, 1915. That's when Pound and the Modernists came up, so that's a good starting point. Let me just start with English language, and then I'll go with a few world poets. And I don't know if I can go three or four. When we're talking about the modernists, I wouldn't include Eliot or Pound, and I don't disclude Pound because of his wacky beliefs and his insanity. But his cantos are just too bad. The cantos are sort of a precursor. They're the poetic equivalent of the Joyce stuff, which in the earlier question I said was a precursor of a lot of the bad crap that we see today. Um, then you get to someone like Robinson Jeffers, who's not considered a modernist. I would say Jeffers definitely has to be up there. His stuff was uh, very popular after his youthful period, when he first hit his stride in the early 20s and started releasing some of his inhumanist poems. Then in the mid to late 30s, when people were egging the country to get into the war, and then once Pearl Harbor happened, he was very much against the war, and that really ruined his reputation. It went in the crapper. So he's a perfect example of a great poet who really just got fucked up the ass by a lot of people. Now I think he was wrong in his political opinions, but that has nothing to do with his greatness as a poet. Uh, Another poet that I would certainly put up there uh, from around the same time period, a little bit later actually, would be Robert Hayden. Hayden doesn't have as many great poems as as Jeffers. He has a number of political poems. He was a black poet, and he's probably, along with maybe James Emanuel, whose work I've championed. I'd say Emanuel or Hayden are arguably the two greatest black poets of the last century. One could make an argument for Gwendolyn Brooks, but her last 20 or so years output got just so silly and political and PC that you can't. Hart Crane,
What about Connie Coleman in the Black Poets category? I'd put him in there as well.
yeah, the reason, probably the one reason I would give Hayden over Cullen is Hayden more engaged with the times. His political poems, when he wrote them, worked more. Cullen, Cullen was the poet in that he was a black homosexual in the early 20th century who was devoutly religious. I mean, he's up there with Gerard Manley Hopkins and John Donne and John Milton as religious poets. There's no question about that. But I would probably, I Cullen maybe has as many or more actual great poems, but I think the great poems of Hayden are more cosmic, if you know what I mean. And James Emanuel, for example, while he maybe is not doesn't have as many great poems as Hayden or Cullen, arguably. Uh, there's some later poems of Cullen that fall into a lot of banal religious rhetoric, and uh, uh, he trails off more. So again, it's one of those things you could argue. Emmanuel, you could argue Gwendolyn Brooks, some of her early poems, especially for a female and a black female, are just very impressive. But if I had to pick one out of all of them, I would probably go with Hayden, maybe just nosing out James in terms of black poets of the last 100 years or so. I would include someone like Kenneth Rexroth. Rexroth is a lesser version of Robinson Jeffers. He was also a well-noted asshole, but it doesn't really matter. He wrote some great stuff. Another Kenneth, there were a number of Kenneths in that time period, but the other Kenneth that needs to be mentioned is Kenneth Patchen. Now, I've known a lot of recrudescent left-wing communist artist poet types who love Kenneth Patchen because he was Red Ken, I think was his name at the time. Uh, and so Rexroth too was dabbled, I think, with communism too. But Patchen, definitely, and Patchen is one of the most absolutely political poets that there is. And not only was he a political poet, but his poetry was written in a very soliloquy, monologue type style. I mean, he was a declamatory poet. He would write from the first person often. He would write from someone speaking. Uh, if you took the best 20 or 24 monologues, 25 monologues of from Shakespeare's plays and had them as standalone poems, the only published poet that could match that would probably be Kenneth Patchen. Uh, so he's someone who's underrated, and he's usually underrated because people don't like his political opinions. He's overrated by the people who do like his political opinions, but I don't give a shit about his political opinions. How he said the things that he said in his poems was what made him great. Sylvia Plath. Well, let me go back. I always lump Hart Crane and Sylvia Plath together. What the fuck are you talking about, Dan? Well, I'll tell you why. Yes, Hart Crane was a homosexual, and yes, he killed himself. Sylvia Plath was a nut job, and yes, she killed herself. But that's not why I linked them. They both lived short lives. I think Crane 33, Plath 32. Crane killed himself when Plath was a toddler, so he came before. But these are probably the two most dynamic language poets published in the English language in the last 100 years. And when I say language poet, I don't mean L-A-N, that language bullshit where, I'm just going to jerk off onto a page. That's Jackson Pollock gimmick art bullshit. And we can talk about Jackson Pollock some other time. But Hart Crane did more with language, at least in the English language, than any other poet that comes to mind. Maybe you could argue John Donne. Maybe you could make a case for some of Gerard Manley Hopkins's, but Hopkins isn't the words; it's the way he strings out his sprung rhythm. But Hart Crane had a density and his wordplay. He could use a polysyllabic 3, 4, 5 syllable word and make it poetic in the context. And it wasn't just showing off. It's not like one of these little young kids in an MFA class. Well, I'm going to be polydextrous. No, that's not the way Crane wrote. And Crane is far superior to both Eliot and Pound, who many people accuse him of imitating. There's no way anyone with a brain could say Crane imitated. He is a language poet. He played with language. You can see, and I've seen books, and I've seen writings, and I've seen also some television programs where you've seen multiple drafts of work. He was someone who was very keenly aware of language. Sylvia Plath, in a very different way, was as well. And Plath was also influential, for better or for worse, for the confessional stuff. She's most known as a confessional poet, but she's really a language poet. She's really a language poet. You look at some of the ways she describes things. She has this Sturm und Drang vocabulary that she just drops into the most banal poems. You read on one of the videos, the one Among the Narcissi, about Percy, an old man just amongst the white narcissi or whatever color they are, and it's a really interesting image, and it's really well executed. And there are a few dozen of her greatest poems have this. The famous ones like Daddy and whatnot. Do have their merits, but a lot of these lesser known poems, like Among the Narcissi, are the ones where you really see the language come into play. And like Hart Crane, she's one of these writers that's non-pareil. She's had a lot of imitators down to the Jory Grahams and the Sharon Olds, but they don't have a vocabulary. They not only don't have a vocabulary, but the facility with the vocabulary. That's what they don't have. And she, like Hart Crane, was able to twist things. You can say Cranian poetry. Yes, there was Stephen Crane who wrote some poems, but he's not really a poet, although he did have those interesting little lines. But when you say Cranian, or when you say Rilkean, or when you say Stevensian, Wallace Stevens, who I'll just mention in a moment, or you say Plathian, you know what you're talking about. You know, it's like when I would write poems, for example, uh, I would I would I would have a poem and I'd be 97% of the way there, and I'd say, God damn, I'm just missing a word. And so, like going to a cupboard with spices, I'd say, well, let me open up Sylvia Plath. Now, I wasn't looking to plagiarize anything, but I'd look for a word, and I'd look at a word and I'd say, oh, that. And if I, 9 times out of 10, I'd know what the word meant, but it wouldn't have come to me. But I'd even look up a word and say, oh, that fits the poem. It might have been not what I was actually looking for, but I say, well, that would make a good adjective. So I drop in that Plathian adjective. Now I have to rewrite the poem because it has a darker tone. Or if I take something from Crane, a word from Crane, and drop it in, it might make what I was writing a love poem to some girl I was infatuated with at the time, but it makes it deeper. And now it's not just a poem about looking at, the comeliness of a woman's ass, but it's a poem about something deeper. It's something maybe about the metrics or the mathematics of the universe. And that's what a great writer can do. And this is why poetry, as I said, is the highest of writing and the highest of the art forms, because it has that magical quality that no other art can even come close to. Wallace Stevens, I mentioned, he's along with those those other two. I don't link him as closely as a language poet with Plath and Crane, because while he certainly did play with language, he didn't play with language with necessarily word choices as much in terms of putting unusual words in, although he sometimes did. It was the way he used them and the way he used repetons, the repetition of a line or an image. Yellow Afternoon, a poem that both of us have read on videos. It comes back to a few key images and a few key word choices. It was in the bottom of things that he found himself, and in himself he found. That's not what I don't know the poem, but he keeps coming back, and it's like a baker that keeps folding the pizza dough, and you need to do that, and he did that better than any other published poet. So he's certainly up there. Stevens, Crane, and Plath, far beyond the people that they're usually associated with. After the middle of the century, and with the death of Plath, it starts thinning out. In terms of published poets, I can't really put anyone up there. There are a few people that I know who have written some great poems, but they don't have the amount of volume of poems that these published poets do. I put myself up there, or my wife. There's a few people from the Uptown Poetry Group that have written great poems that their best stuff equals the best of stuff that's been published. But now to expand out to the world poets, well, the great Jekyll and Hyde of poetry is, what's his name, the Chilean poet, Pablo Neruda. Neruda is the prime example of someone with immense talent. He is, in terms of synesthesia, when he writes his love poems, he's as good as Crane or Plath or Stevens. His love poems, his poems on death, emotion, that are directed inward, he's got 30, 40, 50 poems, you could argue. But the worst of it doesn't border on doggerel, it's absolute doggerel. So more than any other poet that I can think of, he wrote crap and he wrote great stuff, and it's just amazing to think of the dichotomy. When I think of, I'm trying to think. From Australia, the Judith Wright would certainly have to be up there as one of the great poets, and certainly one of the great female poets. She is not as flashy in a sense as Plath, and she probably she's not as influential. But in terms of consistency, regarding Judith Wright, she's not as flashy as Sylvia Plath. But in terms of consistency, she's far more consistent. She's probably the most consistently good. I mean, it. I've got a couple of her collected poem books, and the worst of her poems is just good solid. You know, she has of the maybe 200 or 300 poems of hers that I've read. All of them are at minimum good solid. She'll have 2, 3, 4 dozen maybe arguably great poems, and the rest are all they do something. So Judith Wright, I would have to put up there. Um, Off the top of my head, I'm just trying to think. I can't really think of any English from England. Uh, Probably in the last century, yeah, Osip Mandelstam. I'd have to include him. Uh, Rilke died in 26, so he would just make the cut. And I've mentioned him before. Rilke certainly is right up there with the Stevenses and the Cranes. Mandelstam, I just did a Dan Schneider video interview on Poetry Translation, talking with the translators of Mandelstam and Rilke. And while Rilke sometimes has some bad translations, I'm looking at you, Robert Bly. Mandelstam is I think translator proof. I mean, I've got 3 of his books. Jessica, my wife, has I think 1 or 2, and I've read picked up other books that had many of the same poems, and they're the great poems are great. So he'd have to be up there. Marina Tsvetaeva is the other great Russian poet. A lot of people will say Anna Akhmatova. Tsvetaeva is better. Akhmatova writes. She's probably got 2 or 3 great poems, and a few other good ones, but she's highly overrated. Tsvetaeva gets deeper. I've only got 1 or 2 of her books, but in her best poem, she gets in a lot deeper. Trying to think. Cesar Vallejo is another great Spanish language poet. I think, was he the one who did the long poem Altador? Was that Cesar Vallejo? I'm not sure.
No, that wasn't him.
No, that wasn't him. Okay. I'm trying to think. Just as I said with Neruda, the problem with Spanish language, and especially Latin American poets, is this, and that's they are so fucking political. Everything be political with them, and it ruins the good germ of an idea that they had for the poem. And it's not because being political is in and of itself a bad thing. I've written political things. You've written political things, but the politics has to be subsumed into the art. The art has to be the thing. You are an artist. You're not a politician. And this is what the banana republics, and this is a legacy of American imperialism, is that the art and the culture of Latin America, I think in 200 or 300 years, generally is going to be seen as so juvenile because there are so many writers that are so obsessed. And this isn't just the poets. Jorge Luis Borges, this magical realism, that swept through both poetry and prose in Latin American writers. Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Those are the 2 biggest names. Marquez, just like with the poetry, all of their stories are the same. Marquez's 3 or 4 most famous books are all the same kind of thing. So they're all the same kind of thing in that, just like Franz Kafka, he only has 1 or 2 stories to tell, and he tells them in endless variations. Borges is amongst the worst. And Borges did write poetry too. I don't think what's his name? The other one did, Marquez. Borges's poetry is not good, but his short stories, which are the most lauded thing that he wrote, are so formulaic. He's sort of the Philip K. Dick or Harlan Ellison of Latin America, in that they all have this outrageous little plot point. Everything heads towards that. You know exactly what's going to happen. And anyway, getting back to the poets, let's see, French. Off the top of my head, I can't think of a French poet that I would say would rank amongst the greatest ones. A lot of people will say Andre Breton, but he was mostly crap. let's see, what other major languages? Italian. There are a few that in Italian, and I'm just doing off the top of my head, uh, but none that I would put at really the level of some of the poets I've mentioned. Um, there's really no African poets of any great uh, uh, breadth. And I know there's a certain person who's probably going to be pulling his hair out when hearing me say that. Um, Arab poets, I've read some modern Arab poetry. They seem to have gone down the route of Latin America, a lot of politicized bullshit. Um, Chinese poets of today, there was a fellow I did just yesterday an interview with a guy, Harold Wright, who translated Shintaro Tanakawa's poetry. Tanakawa might be one of the best Japanese poets. Again, there are only a handful. My guess is that there probably are a number of Japanese poets of high quality because filmmakers from Japan in the 20th century was so mind-bogglingly great. Um, uh, is there anyone else that you'd want to ask that you have in mind and want my opinion?
No, I think I'd probably cover all those Hart Crane and Rilke, Sylvia Plath, Stevens, Jeffers. Those are the ones that make the cut for me.
Yeah, and I would say those are the people when you want to talk about a golden age. Those are a core nucleus, and Eliot did write 5 or 6 great poems. Pound probably twice that many. Robert Frost wrote some great poems. I mentioned Rexroth. Allen Ginsberg actually has 10 or 12 great poems before he just started jizzing words in search of teenage boy ass.
What about Carl Sandburg? Can you comment on him?
Yes. Well, Sandburg is an interesting figure. He's one of these people. I mentioned Harold Wright, who translated Shintaro Tanakawa. Sandburg is one of the great folklorists, as well as poets. He documented a lot of the stories. He documented a lot of the folk songs. But he's best known as a poet, and he is very underrated. He is one of the real sons of Whitman in that sense. I would probably... He's not at the level of Jeffers. There are a number of great poems. To me, Four Preludes on Playthings of the Wind is probably his greatest poem, in that it has some depth and length, and it's got just immaculate imagery. It's emotional, it's intellectual, and it says what The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot wishes it could have said. That's a much better poem, Four Preludes on Playthings of the Wind. There's a short little poem, Gone, that's an emotionally affecting poem. There are a number of other poems. The famous one, the burly, brawling, husky, big shoulders, and all that. There are a number of them. The cat comes in on little feet that are good. Oh, E.E. Cummings is someone I should mention. E.E. Cummings, just as I said about what's his name, Cullen being one of the great religious poets, E.E. Cummings is, along with Hart Crane and who else? Someone else, a great lyric poet. But E.E. Cummings' love poems, especially, people wouldn't associate that with him, but he's got probably half a dozen of the greatest love poems published in the English language. He has some great other poems. Again, his most famous poems, the Eating a Plum one, or the one about the fire truck, or whatnot, are the more famous, but they're not really great poems. Oh no, am I thinking, was that William Carlos Williams, or was that Cummings? No. But yeah, the fire truck was Cummings, and the plums, no, the plums might have been Williams, I think.
Yeah, the plums Williams. I think some of the love poems you're thinking about from Cummings, they actually appear in Woody Allen's Hannah and Her Sisters.
That one, the How Small Are Your Hands, or whatnot. Yeah, that's one of the great love poems in the English language. So yeah, he's someone I would have to mention as well. Cummings, very underrated, often dismissed because of his typographical obsession, the typographia, or whatever you want to call his obsession. But he's definitely one of the underrated great poets.